Just a quick warning, and based solely on the title of this video, you can probably assume that these stories do contain disturbing subject matter, and viewer discretion is advised. I have a bit of a weird story, but nonetheless, I still wanted to share it with you. This story took place when I was a sophomore in high school, which was 10th grade. I was an only child, and of course, by this time, expected that I always would be. There were definitely times where I wanted a little brother or sister, especially when I was younger. I craved the sibling bond that a lot of my friends had, and even my parents, but I got used to it as I got older. I guess one good thing about being an only child is that my parents were typically willing to let me attend or sign up for any kind of clubs or events that I wanted to. As they put it, they really wanted me to have a happy and fulfilled life. So, while they pushed me to participate in things that would help me as an adult, I also liked to do things that they were a little less thrilled about. It was kind of my way of rebelling. That is why I signed up for the bowling team at my high school. Would I become a professional bowler and make it my career? Would I get a scholarship to a great college for it? Probably neither of those. But seeing my parents' reactions and them willingly cough up the enrollment fees, it was pretty satisfying to me. Now, that doesn't mean that I didn't take it seriously, though. I loved it, and I got pretty damn good at it, too. I met several friends during our events, and it was a lot of fun. That's kind of where my story starts. I had a school bowling competition against another school, so that's where I was on this night. My parents attended previous tournaments, but not often. Excuses were anything from, I have to work late, to asking me if I needed them there. And because they had to ask that, I never wanted them there. So, I usually went on the bus with the rest of my league. Anyways, we had our tourney, which we just barely lost, but what I loved about my league and our coach was that it wasn't about winning. So, afterwards, we congratulated the other school and we all enjoyed pizza together. One of the girls from the other school had struck up a conversation with me, and after talking for a bit, we got on the topic of games. And then, she invited me to the arcade for a few games of Mortal Kombat. It was actually a lot of fun, and she seemed hella cool, so I gave her my name and phone number so that we could possibly hang out in the future. She introduced herself as Megan. By the time I'd gotten home, I had already had a friend request from her on Facebook. I thought that it was funny how she found me so fast, but I did have a pretty unique name, so I added her back. We continued talking some that night, and from there, we seemed to be starting a pretty good friendship. I thought it seemed innocent enough, until it began to quickly escalate. At first, it would just be a slew of text messages while I was in school. I would text her between classes or during downtime, but if I stopped responding, she would keep going, and then become upset about me not responding, saying childish things like, "Enjoy your perfect friends at your perfect school." It was really weird and out of nowhere, and the first few times it happened, I would ask her if she was okay, and she would just say that she was having a bad time. But as she continued doing it, I became more brash with her, reminding her that I was in class, something that she should have been doing too. I guess when she wasn't getting the reaction she wanted from the texts anymore, she started showing up at my school as it was getting out. Again, she was in a school bowling league, so she had to be close in age or grade as me, so she had to be getting out of school early in order to meet me as our school let out. Our conversations would start out friendly, usually me asking her how her day was and how she got here so fast, and she would typically avoid answering. But she would end up steering the conversation to me and ask me how my day was. And when I start talking about it casually, you could tell that she was getting upset. I would ask her what was wrong, and she would start becoming sarcastic, and again start teasing me about my perfect school and life. I was pretty fed up with her attitude at this point, especially since I still hardly knew her. I told her if she was just hanging out and talking with me to make fun of me, then she could go fly a kite, in nicer terms. I didn't need a bully from another school. She stopped texting me after that, and removed me from Facebook, so I thought that was the end of it. Silly me, I guess. I continued to spot her near my school, or following me out of the parking lot. Sometimes I walked home as I lived pretty close to the school. I would say something to her, such as asking her what she wanted, but she would never talk to me. So, since she wouldn't talk to me, I would just pretend that she wasn't there. When I would walk home, when she was at nearby restaurants or parks that I went to with friends, I just didn't even look in her direction. I didn't have a clue as to why she would be so nice at the tournament, but then turn into such a mean and antagonizing person. But here's where things started to take a turn for me. I was finally at my breaking point. I had told my parents about her in passing, but they never really gave it a second thought. They chalked it up to some other kid just wanting someone new to pick on, and basically gave me permission to defend myself if she ever tried to harm me, but that's about all they had to say about it. I had a league meeting at a nearby bowling alley, and I took a bus home from there. I could feel eyes on me, so I looked up from my book, and who else did I spot but Megan? She looked like she was seething, and to no surprise, I had no idea why. I hadn't talked to her for a while, so I couldn't see how she was mad at me. I wasn't surprised when she got off at the same stop as me, but I continued walking to ignore her. I was already in a bad mood from the day earlier, so I finally turned around and asked her what the hell she wanted from me, and what the hell I could have done to make her so mad at me. After we both just stood there silently, she finally yelled at me between sobs, only confusing me more. "You ruined my life. I have nothing special and you have everything. I hate you and your mother." I was shocked and confused, not knowing what to say or even how to react. I just stood silently as I watched her turn back the way that she came from, and she ran out of view. I continued my walk home, but found myself starting to cry. I couldn't understand why, and I definitely did not understand why I felt guilty. What the hell could I have done to someone I had met less than a month ago to ruin their life? When I returned home, it was pretty obvious that I had been crying, and my mom immediately started asking me what was wrong. My dad was in the room too, but was somewhat preoccupied. I can't remember what he was doing. I began to remind them of the girl, and I told them about Pryor and explained how she had been following me. My mom was already looking curiously at me about the situation. Maybe it was just the rebellious side of me, but they seemed disinterested in me telling them about my problems, so I never bothered speaking about her again. But then I mentioned what happened that night. I told them what she had yelled at me and how I didn't know what to do, but how I still felt really bad about it. My mom looked confused at first, not understanding what she specifically could have done, but then we both noticed that my dad had stopped what he was doing and was just staring in my direction. I can't really say he was staring at me, but maybe past me, like he was zoned out. My mom called his name, to which he finally came back to reality. He apologized that I had to experience that and said that he would look into it, making sure it wouldn't happen again. I didn't know what he meant by that, but we just carried on with our night. Later on, I was in my bedroom doing whatever, when I wanted to grab a bottle of water. As I came out of my room, I could hear my parents talking, and I heard my name, so I immediately became nosy. That conversation that they were having changed my life forever. Based on what I heard, I could piece things together, and I had to confront them for it. They couldn't deny what I heard, but tried to just play with words. I was old enough to know better, though. Come to find out, before I was born, my father had an affair. But that affair was with my mother. She was the other woman. His ex became pregnant, but he wasn't ready to settle down yet, so he messed around. And that's how he met my mom. He ended up leaving his ex and signed over his rights to his daughter, saying that he didn't want anything to do with her. But karma came back around, apparently, because my mom ended up pregnant with me a year later, and he decided to stick around. I think my mom had a lot to do with that. So this was obviously quite the blow to me. I had always wanted a sibling, and even though my parents did take good care of me, they were also honest. And they told me that I would be an only child because they didn't want any more. Hell, they never even wanted one. But finding out that I at least had a half-sister out there had so many emotions swirling in me. She was obviously mad at me, or my family, but I could understand why. And I just wanted to hug her and apologize. My parents, of course, thought that it was a bad idea to get involved for the longest time. I didn't care. I wanted her in my life, even if they didn't want her in theirs. Over time, the relationship with my parents kind of deteriorated. But after a while, my mom understood my reasonings and gave me her blessings. It was difficult at first. Megan was apprehensive and thought that I was just coming around to, I guess, brag further about my perfect life, but she finally began to trust me. We actually had a lot in common. We shared pictures of our childhood, hung out after school, and I even helped her with one of her classes. We grew to actually have a fairly normal sibling bond, and I'm so thankful to have her now. So, there's my story of how my stalker turned out to be a sibling that I didn't know I had. I didn't know what to think of her at first, or what her intentions were with her being so angry and following me, but I'm glad that I happened upon my parents' conversation. And I'm very thankful to have her in my life now. I have a story, or maybe a set of smaller stories, that happened while I was a child. It was something that was recently brought up again between some family members, and while I try my best not to let it get to me, some days it's not so easy. This may be submitted anonymously, but I think overall, I will feel better at least talking about it. Also, I wanted to warn that this happened to me when I was quite young, like up to the age of 5 or 6, I think, so some of it was from my own memory, but there were some missing pieces that have been added by family to help complete the picture for me. My mom was definitely a troubled kid, but I don't think anyone could really answer the why part. She had a good childhood, based on everything I've heard from my grandparents and aunts and uncles. But nonetheless, I was the result of one of her mistakes. She seemed to still be optimistic about my arrival, of course, for all of the wrong reasons. She at first was going to give me up for adoption, something my grandparents even suggested to her, hoping that they could bring her back home and help her turn her life around. But she wanted to keep me, and my grandparents supported her and agreed to help her where they could. I wasn't their first grandkid, but they were always loving to us all. As my mom said to my aunt and others in passing, her plans were to use me, basically, as both payback by getting child support from my father, as well as any other financial support that she could get. She bragged about how much money she made just from having a kid to some of her siblings. She never got child support, however, because she couldn't even prove who my father was, and she never did. Also, she didn't stop drinking or using while she was pregnant, and my birth defects and fetal alcohol syndrome proves that. Of course, nothing was done by the state, because she claimed it must have been an early pregnancy because she swore she stopped drinking after finding out. After I was born, some of my earliest memories of her weren't anything spectacular either. I had a small room with toys, most of which came from my grandparents or aunt, and I typically stayed in there by either force or because my mother just demanded it. I remember some nights being hungry, as I hadn't eaten or even just not feeling well, and I would ask my mom for help. She would get pretty angry with me, yelling at me to go back to my room, and that's what I would do. But I was still a child. I would throw tantrums if I was hungry enough, and then she would come storming into my room with something to eat. Or if it was because I wasn't feeling well, she would have some kind of liquid for me to take or a pill. I was still too young to understand you had to swallow it, so I would always chew it, and would cry because it tasted so awful. But shortly after she would bring me something, I would feel incredibly tired, and typically would lay down wherever I was in my room, whether that was on my bed, the floor, or with my toys. And then, when I would wake up, I would always become violently ill. I remember thinking for a long time as I grew up that I must have had something seriously wrong with me, since I would fall asleep immediately after eating and wake up sicker than I was before. There were even times where she would tell me that she had to do something very important, and demanded that I stay in my room no matter what. I remember one thing she used to say: "If there's a fire, you best figure out how to open that window." It was her way of saying that I was not allowed to open the door. I never thought about it, but now, thinking back on it, at my age and size, I would have never have been able to open one of those windows. When I wasn't being nearly locked in my room, I would be dropped off at my grandparents' house, walking down the sidewalk as my mom left the driveway. Their place, however, was much different from my home. They had 3 meals a day, sometimes even snacks, and when I asked for seconds, they would tease me about being too skinny, and would load my plate up with huge helpings. They had a spare bedroom with a chest full of different toys, and a dresser full of kids' clothes. I always thought of it like a shopping spree, as they always had stuff in there that I hadn't seen before, so I would wear something new and find something new to play with. They welcomed me to watch TV with them in the living room, and even played games with me. I was always so torn because I never wanted to leave my grandparents, but when my mom would come back to get me, and if I made a fuss about leaving, she would immediately send me to my room telling me not to come out again. Then, she would come in with a pill for me to take, even if I didn't say that I didn't feel good. But she was still my mother, so I trusted her, so I took it. And then I would soon drift off. So that was my life as a young child, and something that I just found normal as I knew nothing else. But that all changed one day after my mom took us to meet some guy, and after a brief conversation, we went back home. My mom again demanded that I not leave my bedroom until she told me that I could and I would obey. However, as I played with my toys, I had the urge to use the restroom. I called out for my mom, and when she didn't answer, I opened the door and yelled for her again, saying that I needed to use the bathroom. Again, no response, so I told myself that I would use the restroom quickly and then just return to my room. As I walked out of my room, I looked down the hall to the living room and saw her slumped over on the couch, like she was sleeping. So I followed through with my plan. I then went back to my bedroom and, shortly after, went to sleep on my own that night. The next morning, I woke up and repeated my plan from the night before. The second time, she was still on the couch, but she was more so laying down rather than sitting up like she had been. I went back to my room and played for a while, until I could no longer ignore the sound coming from my stomach. Again, my mom didn't respond to me calling for her, so I decided to just try and get something to eat for myself. I went to the kitchen, and I found a box of graham crackers that were already open. I grabbed some of those and went back to my bedroom. I think I stayed there until and unless I needed the bathroom. I think I even napped a few times, not having anything else to do. I then remember getting hungry again, so I went to grab more crackers and went back to my room, pretending that I was camping since I was up so late. I just remember it being dark. Shortly after, I again fell asleep. I woke up the next day repeating the same process, but I remembered thinking it was weird that my mom had not been up and gone to my room all the day prior, and curiosity got the best of me. This time, I walked straight to the living room and can still remember the stench. She'd gotten sick too, all over the couch and herself. I could tell that she was still breathing, not that I could do much about it being a young child, but I wanted to do something different. So at the risk of her waking up and yelling at me, I grabbed the box of crackers and sat on the floor, turning on the TV. I was hoping that she would wake up before then because I was going to be out of crackers. I sat there most of the day watching TV, occasionally going to my room until I heard someone trying the front door. I knew I was told to never unlock or answer it, so instead, I curled up on the couch with my mom hoping they would go away. But not only did they not go away, they were able to open the door. To my pleasant surprise, it was my Aunt Lisa. I remember her face when she walked in and immediately saw my mom and I. It honestly scared me. I jumped up and all I could think to say was sorry. She waved me over and hugged me, and looked me all over asking if I was okay, and I said I was, but also mentioned that I was really hungry. She asked me to go to my room to get some clothes and toys together, as I was going to stay at Graham and Gramps for a while, which made me happy, so I did what she asked. The next thing I know, my aunt came to my room and she looked really sad, and she started putting my clothes and toys that I picked out in a plastic bag. Then she carried me out the door. I remember looking back at my mom one last time, and I saw her now sitting up on the couch, but her head was still slumped over and her hair was matted with stuff in it. That was the last time that I saw her. My aunt took me to McDonald's before taking me to my grandparents', and I just remember being really happy to be there. My grandma was waiting on the porch for me, and after getting me settled in the living room with my food and cartoons, they all went to talk in the other room. After a few days with my grandparents, I ended up going home with my aunt and uncle, and I lived with them until I was 19. She became what I knew as my mother. I called her by her name, Lisa, But for a while, when I had friends around, I just called her mom to make it less confusing and to not have to explain it to them. When my aunt and uncle had a kid of their own, they even became like a little brother to me that I adored, and we just became a loving and happy family. It wasn't until I was much older that I learned more about what happened to me all those years ago. You see, as a child, and seeing my mom the way she was, I thought she was just sick. But the truth, as you may have already figured out, was that she was an addict. And when she was having withdrawals, or in between, me being around and needing the bare minimum to stay alive annoyed her, and it got in the way. So, she fed me pills, and God knows what else to keep me quiet or mostly unconscious. When I went to the doctors as a kid, I remember them doing a lot of tests, and they even took some of my hair. My aunt confided in me years later that was one of the reasons that she won custody of me. And she checked that my mom was still alive, and then called the cops as we left. I appreciated her honesty when she told me that she didn't care if she lived or died, based on how she was treating me. As of today, I have not heard from my mom since. She tried to get custody back when I was in grade school, but not only did she constantly fail to show up to any of the hearings or complete any of the paperwork, she also never completed the rehab, which was a requirement. After that, she seemingly just disappeared from our lives. She even stopped calling anyone for birthdays and holidays, and to be honest, I'm okay with that. I'm okay if she is never a part of my life again. She could have easily killed me, pumping me full of whatever drugs she had, and not to mention the different people that she brought around. I'm just incredibly thankful that I had other family members that stepped up when she obviously couldn't. And that's all that matters to me. I know that there are kids out there that aren't as lucky as I was. Back when I was very young, I had a friend that I loved to hang out with that I'm gonna call Zach. Zach went to the same school as me, but he took a different bus. So, while he did live close, it wasn't close enough for me to walk there. However, both of our families got along, so we spent a lot of time together outside of school. Sometimes at my place, and also at his, depending on what we wanted to do with our time. He was an only child and they had a pool, whereas I had 2 other siblings and no pool. Very important things as a child. So, yeah. Zach and I were pretty inseparable, and each of our homes had their benefits. Zach lived with his mom and dad in his grandparents' home. His grandma passed away when he was much younger, so I never met her, but his grandpa still lived there, and he was pretty cool. Every time I would come over, he would show me some new magic trick. Usually they were card tricks, but he had a few other ones that I remember involving coins or other smaller objects. I thought it was really cool and actually looked forward to it when I would visit. If we pestered him enough, he would finally tell us how he did it, and I would go home and impress my family with my newfound knowledge. Then, as summer hit, I found myself staying at Zach's home a lot more. However, my family took a vacation, so I didn't see him for about a week. When we returned home, I was pretty excited to see him as I had bought us matching hats. I went over there, but I felt like something was off. I was young, so my focus on what was different was quickly pushed to the back of my mind. After some time, one of us mentioned something about a trick, and that's when it hit me. I hadn't seen his grandpa at all since I'd been there. Usually he was already sitting in his chair in the living room when I arrived, but I never saw him there or anywhere else. Not the kitchen, not passing by in the hall, not even to go check the mail as he liked to do. So I asked Zach where he was. His answer was casual as he explained that he hadn't been feeling well, so he'd been staying in his room, only coming out to use the bathroom. He said that his mom, his grandpa's daughter, would even bring him food. And that seemed like a pretty sound reason to me, so we just continued on with what we were doing. But I became even more curious as I would go over there, and there was still no sign of his grandpa. I asked Zach if we could at least go say hi to him, but he said that he wasn't allowed to go in there. In fact, that day, he told me that he hadn't seen his own grandpa in about a week. When he went to the bathroom, but he remembered how ill he looked, and again chalked it up to not being in there and risk making him worse, or getting us sick. I was still very curious, but I let it go. I wasn't really able to do anything else. I just expressed to my parents how I was kind of sad about not seeing him. My paternal grandfather had passed away, and my maternal grandpa was not as fun. He was more uptight and very strict. But what struck me as odd was when Zach's family suddenly took a vacation. I thought it was weird because it was towards the beginning of the school year. Of course, I was a little upset that my friend just wasn't showing up for school one day, but I still found it an odd time for a vacation. And my parents agreed. They told me something about how some people can only go at certain times, so I just let it go and patiently waited for him to return. But when he finally returned, and I was able to come over again, things definitely felt off. One of the first things I noticed was all the candles that were always lit. I remember one time when my mom dropped me off, our moms started talking about them, and she told my mom about selling them. Then I noticed the locks on Grandpa's door. It was what I now know as a deadbolt-style lock. I asked Zach about it again, and he said that his grandpa wanted to be left alone, and so he added the lock while they were out on vacation. I may have just been a kid, but everything about this seemed really weird. His grandpa was always the social type and very friendly, so it was so out of character for him to become so reclusive. It was probably life as normal for the next month or so, until one day Zach just wasn't at school. I went home and told my parents, and I tried calling to see if he was okay. No one answered. Then, the next day, he was absent again. My mom said that he was probably gone because he was sick and would return a few days later. But that never happened. Days turned to weeks, and then months. But I never saw Zach again. I was relentless, and I asked to go to Zach's to see him, and my parents reluctantly agreed. But when we arrived, she stopped on the street and showed me how the house had looked abandoned. All the toys and decorations in the yard and on the porch were just gone. My mom quickly told me that it looked like they moved, and apologized that it was so sudden and without knowledge. I remember being so upset for weeks. My best friend just up and left, even though I know that it wouldn't have been his choice, obviously, and he never told me or warned me about it. It took me some time to finally get past it. I did have some other friends, but Zach really was my best friend. Fast forward, and I'm now 28, and being invited to our high school's 10-year reunion. I was at my parents' house, and the reunion in our childhood was brought up. We talked about mine and my siblings' classes and friends, and the little shenanigans that we would get into. They expressed the feelings for the friends that we had that they liked, and the ones they didn't care for. That, of course, reminded me of Zach. So I waited for them to bring him up, but they never did. So I did. I mentioned how I loved hanging out with him, and that his family just got up and left one day. My dad kind of laughed and then cleared his throat, while my mom had that obvious look of trying to hide something. I knew that face. She did something similar when she would tell us kids an innocent lie, like to dissuade us from waking up for Santa Claus on Christmas Eve, so I asked her what was wrong. She explained that she knew more about Zach than she let on when I was a kid. Zach and his family didn't just move one day. They were pretty much forced out after a secret they kept was finally dug up. Apparently, Grandpa had definitely been pretty sick, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. When he fell ill, they kept him in his room, but tragically, he passed. However, Zach's parents never reported his death. In fact, they kept his body in his room, covered up and locked in. My parents bounced ideas off of each other and determined that, based on the timing and what they heard on the news, they probably went on their vacation because of the smell. Then they returned and Mom went into heavy cleaning mode, including air fresheners and candles everywhere. When my mom talked to her about candles that day, she said that she could smell something in the air and that it was a smell that she was familiar with. And she used to volunteer for an animal hospital, and they took in animals that were found deceased. She got used to the smell. Because of this, and me telling me all about their grandpa being sick, she called in for an anonymous welfare check. Shortly after, and when I mentioned Zach not being at school, she drove over to their home and saw cop cars and a coroner van out front. She saw Zach's mom out front with a red face and watery eyes like she'd been crying. It didn't take long for the news to pick up on it. Body found in home. Zach's grandfather had died in that house, and they all continued to live there, while he was just left in the bedroom. I was horrified when she told me this. I had stayed in that house while he was there, most likely already dead, but it now made sense as to why my mom didn't let me stay overnight after that day that she came in with me. Some of this was rumored, but putting it all together, it makes sense. Zach's grandparents were pretty well off. They owned their business, but it was shared with their business partner. When he passed, he would leave the business to his partner and not his own daughter. I'm sure he had his reasons. They did live in his house, after all. On top of the business shares, he also got Social Security checks that were pretty much going into their pockets. And if they reported him as deceased, they wouldn't get any of that anymore. So, they tried to keep up the charade as long as possible. Of course, when the welfare check was called, they demanded they open the grandpa's door, where they then found his body. As soon as Zach came home from school, they were gone. His parents were charged with fraud, so Zach was sent to live with someone else. Someone that we didn't know. So, that's how I found out, kind of, what happened to my childhood best friend. The whole time I was sad about not seeing his grandpa, and then sad to just unexpectedly lose my friend. My parents, of course, never told me any of this before, which was understandable, but now that I'm older, it creeps me out knowing how close I was to a dead body, and that they even knowingly lived there with it. I just hope that Zach, first off, wasn't aware of what was happening, and second, I hope he got to live a happy life after he moved, and got away from his messed up and greedy parents. So, that, my friends, was a collection of 3 dark family secret stories. My voice may sound a little more solemn as I do this outro because I don't really feel it would be appropriate to make any kind of joke after telling these stories. I will say thank you to everyone who submitted their stories, or those that posted them, because these stories are... I mean, scary is a word you can use, I suppose, but these dark stories are always just so... sobering? Is sobering the right word? I think you know what I mean. Eye-opening that these kind of things are happening in the world, I suppose. They're things that have happened. So, again, thank you to everyone who submitted their stories. And again, if my solemn tone does depress you or make you upset in any way, shape, or form, I do apologize. I'm not upset. I'm not sad. I just don't feel like I should be my normal, energetic self in this outro, as, again, these stories are very serious. So, and much like the last one I did of these, they're good stories. They're fantastic experiences retold by these people. So, again, thank you. And of course, thank you for listening to this point, my friends. As always, that's greatly appreciated. If you enjoyed this video, please do hit that thumbs up button. Just if you enjoyed the video, of course. If you're new to the channel and want more stories like this, please consider subscribing. You can also leave me a comment down below, letting me know how you're doing, how your day is going, any thoughts you have, or which of these stories you, I suppose, liked the most. There's also Patreon and the join button down below where you can get early access and other things depending on which one you sign up for or how you sign up for it. You can also do a super thanks, which is just a tip to the channel. It's always appreciated but never expected. And, of course, my friends, I hope that you are having a lovely day and a lovely week. And I hope that I see you again here very soon. But until then, remember you are loved, you are valid, you are important. You're the best you that you can be. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise, and don't forget it. And until I see you next time, much love, and sleep well.